Number 5, and this one to me speaks volumes. 80% of listeners listen to all or most of every podcast episode they start. It is time for Build That Podcast, where we will discuss how you can use a podcast to grow your business and expand your influence. I'm your host, Eric Rutherford. Let me encourage you to sign up for the 200 words to move you forward with marketing and podcasting, delivered right to your inbox each Tuesday. Sign up for it at buildthatpodcast.com/the 200. I'll also put it in the show notes. Now, let's jump into today's episode. Myths concerning podcasting float throughout social media and the internet. They are everywhere. And while each myth can and should be addressed, the myth we're going to bust today is, it's too late to start a podcast for my business. Now, the truth is that it is still early in the podcast journey. Even though podcasts have been around for over 20 years, the medium itself is poised for dramatic growth in the next few years. BuzzSprout, which is a podcast hosting platform, one that I'm currently using, has their latest podcast stats. I'm going to drop the link to the article in the show notes. What we're going to do now is look at 10 statistics which really show that podcasting, it's on the upward trend. Number 1, 38% of people ages 12 and older in the United States are monthly podcast listeners. 38% listen to one at least once a month. That is astounding to me because that means that macro demographic of teenagers and 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds, they are listening to podcasting. It's part of their content consumption and tells me podcasts are going to be around for a long time. Number 2, we're going to talk about on a global level. And the first part of that global reach is, as of 2022, Brazil, followed by Sweden and then Mexico, are numbers 1, 2, and 3 in podcast consumption. So that's where podcast consumption is the highest. North America and Asia Pacific regions have the highest number of listeners, and Canada's podcast audience consists primarily of those ages 18 to 34. That in Canada is especially important because if you think about that demographic, that age group, those are the decision makers of tomorrow and today. They're moving into leadership positions if they're not already there. They are going to be setting the tone for the content that will be consumed. Okay, we've gone through 2, and I took a tangent on number 2 and went broad on a global reach. Let's look at number 3. Podcast listeners are more likely to follow brands on social media. So if you're a business and you have a podcast, people are more likely to follow your brand along with your podcast. The two are connected. It definitely opens up that familiarity, that intimacy. They get to know, like, and trust you, and they will follow your brand. Number 4, on average, podcast listeners tune into 8 different shows per week. So 8 shows per week for a lot of podcast listeners. So a lot of opportunity to get into their playlist. Number 5, and this one to me speaks volumes. 80% of listeners listen to all or most of every podcast episode they start. Let me repeat that. 80% of listeners listen to all or most of every podcast episode they start. When you think of YouTube, YouTube is always measuring completion rate. How far in the video did people go? If you think about email, how many emails do you open? Now, don't get me wrong, I am a huge proponent of email. But do you read the whole thing? Social posts come and go quickly, so even if you see it, you may not read it at all. But 80% of podcast listeners, they listen to all or most of every podcast episode they start. That means if you have a podcast and people are joining you and they're taking the time to listen, they're going to listen to just about the whole thing, which drives familiarity, drives intimacy, and builds trust. Podcasting is definitely not dead. Number 6, podcast listeners, they subscribe to an average of 6 shows. Now, that's slightly different from number 4 in terms of listening, but they subscribe to 6 shows on average. And the trick is, how do you get to be one of those 6 so that your episode drops in their feed and they're looking forward to it every week? BuzzSprout, they also broke out a group of what they call super listeners, and they reference the Edison Research Super Listeners 2021 survey for these next few bullet points. So for number 7, for super listeners, they consume an average of 11.2 hours of podcasts a week. Number 8, they often listen to content that also includes video. So now we're seeing the video podcasting coming into play. Number 9, these super listeners discover podcasts through YouTube most often. 19% of super listeners, that's how they find podcasts. And number 10, 94% are more likely to subscribe to some kind of premium streaming service. Now, I've got a bonus coming up here momentarily, but first, let's talk about these super listeners. Videos included. They find podcasts through YouTube. This is an incredible opportunity for repurposing content. If you have an audio podcast, you can easily convert it to a video podcast. You can create video podcasts through video interviews that make it really easy to do. So video is the new frontier or a complementary channel to audio podcasting. All of this to say, podcast growth and podcast listenership is on the rise. And here is bonus statistic from BuzzSprout, number 11. Current estimates project that listeners in the United States could increase from 75.9 million to 100 million listeners in the U.S. by 2024. So that's a 33% increase. Podcasts, they are alive and well, no decrease of consumption in sight. So as we wrap up, remember there are changes in the marketplace. Videos becoming a component, ability to repurpose and hit multiple channels is becoming more prevalent. However, podcasting is only going to increase from here. Make sure to sign up for the 200 at buildthatpodcast.com/the 200 and receive 200 words every Tuesday to move you forward with marketing and podcasting, delivered right to your inbox. Lastly, if you have questions or comments, you can find me on LinkedIn at Eric Rutherford, DM me on Twitter at rfordej, or email me at eric@straightforwardmg.com. Remember, use podcasts to grow your business and expand your influence.